The night was quiet in the small suburban neighborhood, but inside Dr. Alan Mercer's home, chaos was unfolding. His wife, Linda, had suddenly collapsed in the kitchen, her face pale, her breathing shallow. "Linda, stay with me, sweetheart," Alan pleaded, his hands trembling as he felt for her pulse. He was a respected emergency physician, but at that moment, he was not a doctor. He was just a husband, terrified of losing the woman he loved. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. 11, what's your emergency?" came the calm voice of the dispatcher. "My wife. She's not breathing right. I need an ambulance immediately." Alan's voice cracked. The dispatcher assured him help was on the way, but time felt like it was standing still. Alan ran outside to flag down the ambulance when it arrived. But as he opened the front door, he was confronted by something he never expected. The HOA security patrol. 2 men in dark uniforms stood in his driveway, their flashlights glaring into his eyes. "Sir, you're violating community rules," one barked. "You can't have emergency vehicles blocking the street at this hour." Alan stared at them in disbelief. "My wife is dying. The ambulance is on its way. Get out of the way." But the HOA guard stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "You need to calm down, sir. You're disturbing the peace." "Disturbing the peace? My wife can't breathe," Alan shouted, tears welling in his eyes. "Move your car, now." Instead of helping, one of the guards reached for something on his belt. Before Alan could react, a sharp pain ripped through his body. His muscles seized, his legs buckled. He had been tasered. Alan collapsed onto the pavement, convulsing. He could barely gasp for air, his chest burning. Inside the house, Linda lay unconscious. Alone, and in that moment the cruel irony became clear. A doctor, tasered by his own neighborhood security, while trying to save a life. Minutes later, the ambulance finally arrived, sirens wailing. The EMTs rushed in, finding Alan on the ground and Linda barely clinging to life. The guards tried to protest, but the medics shoved past them. "Double quotes, sir? Are you hurt?" One EMT asked Alan, who could barely lift his head. "Forget me." "My wife." "Please," Alan whispered. The EMTs stabilized Linda and rushed her into the ambulance. Alan, his body still shaking, followed close behind. But in that ambulance ride, a storm began to brew inside him. Fear and desperation were replaced with something else, rage. Because this wasn't just about an HOA. It's overstepping its authority. This was about human decency, about life and death. The line had been crossed. And Alan, broken but unbowed, knew this story was far from over. At the hospital, Alan sat beside Linda's bed, clutching her hand as machines beeped softly around her. She had survived the night, but just barely. The doctors told him she'd need time to recover, but the damage could have been worse if help had been delayed any longer. And Alan knew exactly who had caused that delay. He replayed the moment over and over, the HOA guard's cold stare, the crackle of the taser, his own body collapsing helplessly while his wife suffered inside. When Linda finally opened her eyes, weak but alive, Alan broke down. "What happened?" she whispered. "You don't worry about that, love. You just get better," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But she could see the storm in his eyes. The next day, Alan filed a formal complaint with the local police department. To his shock, the officers seemed hesitant. "Dr. Mercer," the officer said carefully, "the HOA claims you were aggressive and non-compliant. They said they used force for their safety." Alan slammed his fist on the desk. "For their safety? I was calling an ambulance for my wife. Do you hear how insane that sounds? But bureaucracy has a way of muddying the truth." Weeks passed, and instead of the guards being arrested, Alan started receiving violation notices from the HOA. Claims that his yard was unkept, that his driveway had illegal markings, that his behavior was a threat to the community. It wasn't just harassment, it was intimidation. They wanted him to stay quiet. But Alan was no ordinary man. He had spent decades fighting for lives in emergency rooms. He wasn't about to let his wife's near-death become just another footnote in an HOA report. So he made a decision that would shock them all. He hired a federal attorney in the attorney's office, Alan poured out everything: the 911 call, the taser, the harassment afterward. The attorney, a stern but compassionate woman named Rachel Stern, listened carefully, her face growing darker with each detail. "Dr. Mercer," she said at last, "this isn't just assault. This is a violation of federal law. They obstructed emergency medical services, and they used excessive force. We're not talking about a local complaint anymore. We're talking about a federal civil rights case." Alan leaned forward. "Then let's burn their empire to the ground." Rachel nodded. "We'll file for a federal lawsuit. Damages of $5 million. And we'll make sure criminal charges are brought against those guards." For the first time since that terrible night, Alan felt a spark of hope. Not just for justice, but for Linda, for himself, and for every neighbor who had been bullied into silence by the HOA's abuse of power. And as news of the lawsuit spread through the neighborhood, something unexpected began to happen. Neighbors started knocking on his door. "Dr. Mercer," an elderly woman said, tears in her eyes, "they tasered you. I believe it. They threatened me too when I complained about fees." "Doc, you're doing the right thing," another man said. "We've all been scared of them, but not anymore." Alan realized he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for an entire community living under fear, and that gave him more strength than he ever thought possible. The courtroom was packed the day the trial began. On one side, the HOA board members sat stiffly in suits, their faces pale. On the other, Alan sat beside Rachel, his hand resting on Linda's as she bravely supported him. The prosecutor laid it out plain and simple. This is not just a case of a neighborhood dispute. This is about a doctor tasered while calling 911 for his dying wife. This is about obstruction, abuse of power, the blatant disregard for human life. The defense tried to twist the narrative. Dr. Mercer was aggressive, a HOA's lawyer claimed. He threatened our security. They acted out of self-defense. Alan couldn't contain himself. He stood, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "Self-defense? I was begging you to move your car so an ambulance could reach my wife. Does that sound like a threat?" Gasps filled the room. The judge had to call for order. Witness after witness testified. Neighbors spoke of being bullied, fined, and harassed by the HOA. An EMT testified that the delay could have cost Linda her life. But the most damning evidence came when the 911 call recording was played. "Please, my wife isn't breathing. Hurry!" Alan's desperate voice filled the courtroom. Then, in the background, the guards' harsh voices could be heard, followed by the chilling crackle of the taser. The courtroom fell silent. No one could deny what they had just heard. By the time the defense rested, it was clear. The HOA's empire was crumbling. When the verdict was read, the words echoed like thunder. Guilty. The HOA security is liable for assault, obstruction, and civil rights violations. The judge ordered criminal charges for the guards and approved. The $5 million federal lawsuit. Alan turned to Linda, tears streaming down his face. "We did it," he whispered. But as the HOA members were led away, something remarkable happened. Neighbors who had once been silent approached Alan, thanking him, hugging him, telling him how much his courage had meant. For the first time, the neighborhood felt united, not under fear but under justice. Months later, life slowly returned to normal for Alan and Linda. The settlement allowed them to pay for Linda's medical care, and the HOA leadership was permanently dissolved. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alan and Linda sat on their porch. "Holding hands, Alan," Linda said softly. "Do you ever regret what happened? All the fighting, the stress?" Alan shook his head. "No, love. Because sometimes standing up isn't just about us. It's about everyone who can't. If we stayed silent, they would have kept hurting people. But now, they know we won't be silenced." Linda smiled, tears in her eyes. "You didn't just save me that night. You saved this whole neighborhood." Alan kissed her forehead gently. "And I'd do it again." The lawsuit and trial had changed. More than just their lives, it had sent a message across the country. News outlets picked up the story, warning HOAs everywhere that abuse of power would not go unchecked. And in that quiet moment, Alan realized something profound. Life will always throw storms our way. But it's in those storms that true courage is born. So if you've ever been silenced, bullied, or pushed down by those in power, remember Alan and Linda's story. Because sometimes, the fight for one life becomes the fight for justice for all. Final note to audience, and that's where our story ends. But the lesson remains. Never let fear silence you when you know the truth. What about you? Have you ever stood up against unfair authority, even when it felt impossible? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear it.